of Community Engagement and Public Affairs for the Kansas City Public Library, and I'd like to welcome all of you, as well as all of our patrons who are watching on our library YouTube channel from home or from wherever you are. So we are on to our next installment of Making a Great City, a series of conversations that the Kansas City Public Library began over 8 years ago to explore how cities can grow smarter, stronger, and more equitable. Tonight, we turn our attention to a key but often overlooked driver of economic development, housing. And we're very excited to hear from A.J. Herrmann of Accelerator for America, followed by a local panel who will be diving into the challenges and opportunities that we face in our region. Before we begin the program, though, I want to highlight an upcoming program that we have coming up in November, and this is actually a fundraiser at UMKC. The annual fundraising dinner supports free public writing classes and graduate student internships through a partnership between the library and UMKC's MFA program in creative writing, and it's called Writers for Readers. This year's featured guest is best-selling author Candace Millard, whose works I'm sure you've all heard of, including Hero of the Empire and River of the Gods, and they've captivated readers worldwide. She'll be joined in conversation by novelist and UMKC professor Whitney Terrell, offering insights into her career, research, and her upcoming new book at the first of the year. The evening also features the announcement of this year's Maya Angelou Book Award winner for poetry. That's a national prize recognizing literary excellence and a commitment to social justice. So we please hope that you'll join us and find out more information at kclibrary.org for Writers for Readers. And now, to introduce tonight's program and panel, please welcome a longtime leader in this wonderful series, Making a Great City, and thoughtful urban designer, Principal Emeritus at Multi-Studio, Dennis Strait.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for caring about our city and being curious enough to come to this discussion. This is the second installment in our four-part series this year that's focused on this idea of housing as economic development. If you weren't able to make it to the first one, to hear Chuck Marone talk about all the reasons why we struggle with housing these days, and how we can go forward and start to work through these problems, I'd encourage you to find his video online. The library does a great job of capturing the presentations and making them available either through their website or just you can go to YouTube and search them out pretty easily. But I encourage you to take a look at that. And even if you were here, I'd encourage you to take a second watch of it because it was filled with great information and insights into why we struggle with housing and why it's become a crisis around the country and why we need to do something about it. So that's part of the reason why we're focusing on housing this fall as part of the series. Tonight, A.J. Herrmann's going to help make the case for why housing should be economic development, because we don't normally talk about housing as an economic development strategy. But our group tonight is going to help make the case for why that's important to the future of our city. And then please mark your calendars for November 13th. Allison Quinlan's going to be here to help us understand how we can accomplish the kinds of new development, neighborhood development, redevelopment that we need to be doing, and the barriers we need to get out of the way so that small developers around the country, but certainly here in Kansas City, can be able to do the work they want to do in our neighborhoods and our communities more easily so we can have more of that activity going on. And then in February 5th, Kobe Lefkowitz is going to be in town to show us why we should be optimistic about this next phase of the housing creation here in Kansas City. So please join us for those upcoming dates. So as an introduction to the overall series, one of our speakers helped us see our city in a new way by providing maps like this that show us where we're getting good return in terms of private development throughout the city. And that's important because that's a direct reflection about our tax generation, which is important because with our taxes, we're able to do all the things that we're supposed to be able to do as a city. And what this map shows in both 3D and in a color tone is those colors that are in orange and the warm tones in orange and purple are where we're doing really well. Those tones that are in green and getting to yellow, not so much. And that's something we need to be paying attention to because cities have always had that pattern to them but typically there isn't so much green stuff. There's a better balance between where you have highly productive land and not so productive land. When this map was updated for us just last year, the group that does these, Joe Minikasi's group out of Asheville, North Carolina, also did another set of maps for us. The value per acre map shows property tax value. This map compiles not just property tax, but sales tax and income tax, or earnings tax, as we all talk about it here in Kansas City. So they stacked all that together so we could see where our tax revenues are coming from on a geographic basis. And you can see still that those areas that are popping up really high are kind of recognizable because they're actually on the right, that's downtown, and in the middle, that's the Country Club Plaza. And all that zone throughout the really higher blocks and spikes is that zone from the river down to about 63rd, 75th Street, from State Line over to Truce. That's what we call the economic engine of the city. That's where the most productive real estate is. And then you can see how it drops off in all the other areas of the city. Well, Urban 3 did a favor for us, and they showed us not just where all the tax revenue is coming from, but then they did a map to show us when you subtract out city expenditures, what's left over. And that's what this map shows. And literally it shows where we're in the black and where we're in the red. And you can, once again, see that economic engine of downtown down to the Country Club Plaza and a little bit further south. But you can see how much of our city is in the red, how much of our city is not able to generate enough revenue to provide the funding we need for the city services we need. And that's why we struggle with everything from taking care of our streets to keeping our streets safe. So what we're trying to do in this series is figure out a path forward to work our way out of this challenge. Part of what we've looked at over the years is to understand how the city has changed over the last 100 years. This is a map of 1940 Kansas City in the heavy outline where you see all the yellow highlight. In 1940, you could say Kansas City peaked out as a city because in 1940 we had the most number of people sharing every square mile of the city that we've ever had. In fact, we had nearly 7,500 people sharing every square mile of our city. If you talk to urban planners and transportation planners, they'll tell you that when you get to that number of people sharing every square mile, you get to a level that supports a robust transit system. And a robust transit system is what really makes a city a full-fledged city, because now it provides a whole range of different opportunities for housing and business and a number of other things. So we really peaked out almost 85 years ago as a vital city. If you look at where we are today, you can see that our vitality has dropped tremendously because, and we've talked about this through the series, since 1940, we have taken on 5 times as much city by the way that we annexed and expanded to the north and to the south. But if you look at our population, it's only grown by about 10 or 15%. So the story we've told for the last 8 years of the series is that we've created a city that's 5 times more expensive for all of us citizens to pay for. And frankly, we can't afford to pay for it, and that's why we're not meeting our basic service obligations as a city. So there's an opportunity to change that, and we can be strategic about how we change that, and we can be strategic using housing as our strategy for changing that, and that's what we're talking about with the series this go around. This is a map that shows an idea being proposed for trying to find a way to get 100,000 people back to Kansas City over the next 25 years. It's not a far-fetched idea. We've had 100,000 people of growth over the last 25 years. Unfortunately, most of that growth has been outward. It's been outside of that 1940 boundary to our northern suburbs and our southern suburbs. For us to be successful going forward, we need to find ways so those next 100,000 people coming are helping us to balance that equation between the parts of the city that are in the black and doing well and the parts of the city that are in the red and struggling in terms of creating enough tax revenue. So by being strategic, by being thoughtful about how we continue to develop in our northern and southern suburbs, and by being thoughtful about how we can repopulate the depopulated central city, because most people don't think about this, but over the last 30 years, as we've been revitalizing our downtown and doing a lot of really good things, we've also continued to lose 25,000 people over the last 25 and 30 years here in the central city of Kansas City, Missouri. We're still losing population in the heart of the city, and it's threatening our ability to be a full-fledged city. And that's why we're really focusing on this issue. So tonight we're going to get into this topic about housing as an economic development strategy. A.J. Herrmann is going to lead our discussion, and then he's going to invite a panel up. The panel has Terrell Jolly, who's the CEO of Integrity Capital Management. I've gotten to know a lot of people over the last 10 or more years having these discussions. There's nobody in Kansas City who's more passionate about the importance of housing creation to the future of our city, or more frustrated about how difficult it is to create housing in our city than Terrell. So I'm thanking him for being on the panel. Erin Wynn from Johnson County. Erin is the government relations coordinator who's focusing her efforts on housing. Because housing is not just a Kansas City, Missouri issue. It's an issue, as you know, all around the country. And the Kansas suburbs have the same challenges that we're talking about here. So she's going to provide a Kansas perspective on the discussion tonight. And then because we're talking about economic development, we needed an actual economic developer, somebody with credentials. And so I've got to thank Joe Perry for joining us tonight. Joe is the economic development executive for the city of Lee Summit. He previously was with the Port Authority. He, before that, was a developer doing housing creation all throughout our metro. He's got a lot of good insight to bring to the table, so I'm really excited about our panel. And I'm thrilled that AJ has agreed to do this. When we started on looking for somebody who could help us understand this idea of housing as economic development, we did some Google searching, and it led us to A.J. Herrmann. And fortunately, when we reached out to him, he was happy to come and present. So let me give a quick introduction. A.J. is the Director of Policy and Program and Innovation for Accelerator for America. That's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides research and development for America's cities on important issues like neighborhood revitalization, increasing housing supply and affordability, access to capital and workforce development initiatives. AJ holds a master's degree from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. In his present role, AJ leads Accelerator for America's housing work through the National Housing Crisis Task Force, and he collaborates with city leaders nationwide to develop plans and foster economic mobility for all. We're fortunate to have him tonight to help us think about this idea of housing and economic development. So please help me welcome A.J. Herrmann.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you to Carrie, Steve, Sophie, all the library staff who helped set this up. And I'm really excited to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a very nice October night in Kansas City to talk a little bit about housing. And I should say, too, it's really an honor to be back here. I lived in Kansas City for 12 years until this summer. I recently moved to Houston because my wife got a job down there. I see some friends in the audience, which is awesome, but my kids used to run around upstairs in this library all the time. I lived in Midtown on 39th Street, so this is a great excuse to be back, and I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the themes Dennis just hinted at, and I'm really excited about our panel that we're going to have in a little bit, but I wanted to talk about housing and economic development through the lens of something that I've been a part of for about the last year or so, which is the National Housing Crisis Task Force. I'll give a little bit more context on that in a second, but I'm assuming if you showed up tonight, you probably agree that we are in a housing crisis, but in case you don't, I do want to talk a little bit about some stats that will maybe help convince you. And so, you know, home prices, I'm going to list some of the national numbers, right? Since 2019, home prices in the US have jumped an average of 47%. Incomes, by the way, in that time have gone up about 30%. So even though we've seen an increase in incomes, home prices have far outstripped it. Since 2012, the number of rental units available nationwide for less than $1,000 a month have fallen by 25%. And since 2015, in the last 10 years, the number of unhoused people staying outside of shelters has increased by 48%. The numbers in Kansas City are very similar. Home prices here are up almost exactly the same, 47% since 2019. Rent has increased around 31%, depending what measures you look at. Units renting for less than $1,000 a month have dropped by 20 or 30%. Unsheltered homelessness has actually gone up even more here than it has nationally. That was from a lower figure. And as all of that was happening, personal income has only increased 28% in the KC Metro. So when we talk about housing as economic development, something I want to stress is that part of the point of economic development when you talk about it is helping people get better paying jobs, career pathways into professions that can help you in the long term, and all of that's critically important. But if you're spending more on housing, then you're earning more, and in a degree you're falling further behind. So that's when we say housing is critical for economic development, that's kind of that interaction I'm trying to talk about. So in response to this, Accelerator, the organization I work for, along with a bunch of other partners, started and launched the National Housing Crisis Task Force last summer. It's co-chaired by the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, the mayors of Atlanta and Cleveland, Andre Dickens of Atlanta, Justin Bibb of Cleveland, and Susan Thomas, who's the president of Fifth Third Bank's Community Development Corporation. They're a large regional bank that works in parts of the Midwest and the South. They do a lot of investment into LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit products, and do a lot of investment into affordable housing development in general. And this is really intentional. We wanted to have mayors, because mayors are critical for housing supply. We wanted the governor. We also have a Republican governor and 2 Democratic mayors, because housing is a bipartisan issue and should be. And then obviously the finance side, since it's so important for housing production. 24 task force members representing really all aspects of housing, developers, investors, affordable housing advocates, people who run public housing authorities, architects. So the idea being, if we can get this group of people to agree on some ideas that could help solve our housing crisis, we're really getting somewhere. And the fact that this group is bipartisan and crosses sector, I think makes us a little bit different from some of the other housing groups that are out there. We also have a mayor's implementation committee that's co-chaired by 15 mayors, including our very own Quentin Lucas here in Kansas City, who's also the co-chair of AFA's advisory council, as well as Mayor Kate Gallego of Phoenix, Arizona. So to get some input from kind of the city mayor perspective. But why is housing essential for economic development? I've talked about this a little bit, but it's the single largest expenditure in most household budgets. And as I said, if housing prices increase faster than incomes, folks are falling further behind. Metros with higher housing costs are also more likely to see population outflows. You see this in places like California, where I actually grew up, but as well as some other very high-cost coastal cities, is that they're having trouble hiring for critical jobs like first responders, teachers, social workers, with the corresponding declines in some cases in tax revenue for supporting schools and essential services, getting at some of what Dennis was talking about in his intro. And obviously, historically, Kansas City has been relatively affordable and actually remains relatively affordable by national standards, but that was also true of places like Boise, Atlanta, and Nashville that have seen huge run-ups in housing costs in the last few years. So just because it hasn't happened here yet, at least to the extent elsewhere, doesn't mean it couldn't. Also, building housing creates jobs and opportunity, right? Building more housing has been shown to reduce the rate of rent increases and home value appreciation. And in some cases, it even reduced average rents, Austin, Texas being a notable example of that. Construction jobs tend to pay well, but you need sufficient demand and to have a steady supply of workers, suppliers, and developers to really get sort of that boost going. And part of the emphasis of the task force is the idea that local leaders, and that's inclusive of both elected officials, but also philanthropic organizations, leaders of incentive agencies, developers, investors, can really act with intentionality to support housing production, leading to expanded housing choice and affordability. And the key here is intentionality, right? Is that sometimes we tend to treat housing as something that just happens, but there are policy levers you can pull to make more housing happen, and places have shown they can do it.
Could you speak up louder?
Yeah.
Slower?
Happy to do that. Happy to speak both louder and slower. Is that better? I'm seeing nods. So this National Housing Crisis Task Force, one of the big things we did is earlier this year, we released a state and local housing action plan, which describes 15 ways that cities, states, some cases other actors all over the country have boosted housing production. And part of what we wanted to do in this is really highlight what are specific things that have actually been tried somewhere, are actually working to boost housing production. So this isn't hypothetical, this is actually working, and across a variety of dimensions, right? And so this report came out in June. If you want to read the whole thing, it's about 200 pages, but you can find it at www.nationalhousingcrisis.org. You can also Google it, and it should show up. But I'm going to talk through a couple of the examples from that toolkit as part of this presentation that I think illustrates some of the work that we're talking about and what it means to take housing and economic development seriously. And I should also say that thematically, the way that we think about this is sort of across different dimensions of housing production, because housing is really complicated, right? It involves land, it involves capital, it involves rules, local regulations, state regulations, it also involves workforce. And so thematically, we sort of think about housing across all of those dimensions. So land, a bunch of cities, including Atlanta, Cincinnati, and Chattanooga, are launching what they call public asset corporations, which are essentially ways that you take something like a housing authority, which is what Atlanta and Chattanooga have done, and give it more powers to actually activate public land and build housing on public land. In some cases, that includes tax incentives. In some cases, that just means finding ways to get public land that maybe is underutilized into production for housing, right? Streamlining processes. In Atlanta, it's things like partnering with the school district in order to find schools that have either closed or are underutilized and find ways to redevelop it. Atlanta is also they are building a new 25-story apartment building literally on top of a fire station that needed to be redeveloped, which is going to be 60% affordable, right? So it's sort of getting creative with how you activate public land for the purposes of building housing. There's also something called municipal property advisors, which is very much in line with what Dennis was sharing about sort of the value of land per acre and things like that. But it's understanding the full scope of land within a city. Where does it make sense to develop? What kind of things does it make sense to develop? Is this the right kind of property that we should be developing a rather large apartment building on? Or is this something where it may be suitable as not housing, but something else, right? And sort of talks through how you can think through some of those things. Capital is obviously extremely important for housing production. You need money to build housing. Something that Kansas City has actually done really well is housing ballot measures. As hopefully most of the folks in the room know, the city passed a bond measure in 2022 overwhelmingly to fund the city's housing trust fund to the tune of $50 million, which has been successful in creating thousands of units in the city. That is not something that a lot of places have done, so Kansas City should commend itself for doing it, but there might be opportunities to go bigger. And this is something that's really beneficial, especially in today's environment where those dollars can be locally controlled, they can be directed to what local leaders think they should be, and they're more flexible and maybe more reliable than in some cases federal dollars are right now. There are also a number of examples of place-based philanthropy really stepping up and investing in housing in a real way. And that's not just inclusive of, say, traditionally how philanthropy is engaged with providing grants to homeless services organizations or home counseling organizations, but actually creating impact investment funds that actually invest directly in housing production. Atlanta, again, is a really great example of that. Their community foundation raised a $200 million fund that specifically invests in affordable housing and workforce housing production as an investor in projects where they're actually partnering with developers in the city in some cases to really boost housing production because they see housing affordability as crucial to their mission of promoting economic mobility. I see Jeff from LISC in the audience, so I'm going to shout him out a little bit, but I know recently there was an announcement for a regional housing partnership in Kansas City that's a partnership with LISC and Mark and a few other organizations, which potentially is a great step in that direction for Kansas City. So I applaud that, and I think it's a great opportunity for the city. There's also mixed income public development where the sort of primary example of this I want to highlight is Montgomery County, Maryland, which is outside of DC and the DC suburbs. Their housing authority is actually partnering and serving as a lead developer where they're developing essentially mixed income condo projects, apartment projects that are almost luxury if you look at them, but that have, because they're putting in public money which can be deployed at a lower rate, they're able to get some of those units to be really affordable and also are creating mixed income communities where people of all kinds and all professions can live. There's a great New York Times story about that you can find if you search Montgomery County Housing Authority that sort of gets into the nuts and bolts of how they did this. And it's a great example sort of how public agencies can maybe show more leadership and also more creativity than they traditionally have in helping solve this issue. Regulation, policy, and governance, I'm sort of combining a few different things into one for trying to be brief, but land use permitting and building code reform, this has been a huge topic of conversation in a lot of places. Zoning reform is one of these things, but it's also streamlining permitting. How do you make it easier to build? And also, how do you build the right things in the right places? Places all over the country, sometimes at the state level, sometimes at the city level, are passing rules that make it easier to build. And then finally, organizing capital for community development. I thought this was interesting because it's Alabama, which is not necessarily a state that people maybe think of in terms of leading on housing development and economic mobility, but as a state, they actually created a nonprofit that helped channel private capital into opportunity zones, which is a clause that was in the first tax cuts in the Trump administration that just got renewed in the bill that passed this summer, that basically helps connect capital to projects that need it, including housing at a statewide level, understanding that there are a lot of places that maybe don't have access to some of the national funders, the big investment banks and things that maybe are looking for projects but aren't necessarily looking in a place like Alabama to invest in needed housing, right? And so that's something that at least at the state level shows some promise. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Houston, where I just moved, as an example of maybe what it looks like to take housing production seriously, and especially as a contrast, I think, to some of what I've seen here. Houston has consistently led or been in the top 3 of US metros on housing units produced. And that's, the stereotype maybe is of that's all suburban growth, it's all sprawl, which there is a lot of sprawl and there is a lot of suburban growth in Texas. But Houston in particular passed a major land use reforms in the late 90s, which really made it a lot easier to build, especially in the urban core. And this gets to some of what this series has been talking about, is how do we incentivize building in the right places? How do we make it possible to build in the right places? So this picture up here is what's called a Houston townhouse, which is actually a typology that's sort of recognized nationally as a architectural style. It's actually where I live in something, not this one, but one that looks like this right now. And 30% of the new homes in Houston's inner loop, which is sort of the historic core of the city, analogous to the 1940 boundaries of Kansas City that Dennis highlighted, are townhouses. And that's because the city made it essentially legal by right to build townhouses and to build on small lots within the city. And that has created an entire ecosystem of developers, people who know how to do this, people who know how to finance it around these houses. I want to say this isn't a panacea, this isn't something that makes everything great. Houston has very limited investment in transit and infrastructure, which causes traffic issues and all other kinds of things. So it's not that Houston is doing everything right, but it's also an example of what it looks like to have housing as an economic development strategy really taken seriously, because it sort of creates this flywheel effect where you have a lot of developers building a lot of houses, which creates a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunity, and that kind of builds on itself. So what could this look like in KC? I've highlighted a lot of this already, and some of this I want to stress is already happening here, but this could be a more coordinated approach to land development, especially for publicly controlled land, and that's both within the city but across the broader metro, and I think we might talk a little bit about that on the panel. Better alignment and right sizing of incentive programs to making sure those are matching the kinds of housing we need. A regional philanthropic fund, as I mentioned, for investing in housing production, promising steps in that direction. Zoning and land use policies, which allow for more housing choice in all parts of the metro, not just in the city. Enhanced regional transit, which is not something we talk about in the action plan, but being able to get from where you live to where you work helps bring down housing costs, right? It helps make more homes accessible for you all. And the fact the streetcars opening in a week is a great example of that mobility, but how do we extend that to other parts of the metro? And finally, intentional support for the construction workforce and emerging developers, especially developers who are looking to do infill housing in the urban core, right? What does it actually look like to really foster that, the folks who are trying to do that kind of work and really support them? So that is it for my talk. I want to invite the panel to come up, and I want to have a further discussion of this, sort of talking through what this could look like in Kansas City, what I may have gotten wrong, what are opportunities and challenges to support housing in Kansas City. So thank you. Welcome, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to start with just asking each of the panelists, I know Dennis did a great job, but just to introduce yourselves and also tell us a little bit of what you see your current role is in helping boost housing production in the Kansas City metro. So Terrell, I'll start with you.
Yes, thanks for having me. Want to reintroduce my name again? No, I'm sorry. What I try to focus on at Integrity Capital Management is just simply putting roofs up. Because at the end of the day, that's where hope starts, at home. And if you don't have hope, you don't value anything around you. So I think my role is just simply getting roofs over people's houses.
Joe Perry, in my work in Lee Summit, it's maybe not intuitive that it would be about building dense nodes of urban development in what has been a bedroom community with no density in the past. But one of the reasons I left a job and a team that I loved at Port KC after 15 years was to go work in a community that wanted to do exactly that. They wrote a comprehensive plan 3 years ago that lays out a vision of how to build dense, urban, serviceable nodes that actually pay for themselves at time. They used a fiscal model and a physical model simultaneously, and that's why I wanted to go do work in that community, because it works better for commercial development too when you do that. And it certainly works with the potential of serving that with transit. And so all of those things made it, and I had loved doing land development in Lee Summit 18 to 23 years ago before I went to the port. So that was an easy choice to go back to a community that had a progressive idea of what they wanted to be then also. In my not work, when I go to, as a board member at Save Inc., and I look at the 1,150 families a month that we help bring housing to, some of the most hard cases of getting a roof over in the city, and those people come to us for 4 or 5 different ways that they're housing insecure, and it makes me really care about a multiple-pronged approach.
Thank you. Aaron Wynn from Johnson County Government. They made the Kansans sit over here, separate from the
That's what the
jury.
table's about.
That's right, that's right. So I think, it's indicative of the way that the housing crisis transcends boundaries, right? Both industry and jurisdictional, particularly acute in a bi-state metropolitan area. So in Johnson County, we have 19, 20-ish municipalities. So Johnson County government does not control land use decisions or approve housing development projects and anything that happens within city limits, which is the vast majority of projects. However, I think, AJ, you alluded to the fact that cities like Boise, Atlanta, Nashville are seeing rising housing costs. In Johnson County, the average home value is now over $500,000. From 2018 to 2023, the percent of homes that were valued under $300,000, which while still out of reach for a lot of folks, could kind of be considered as a starter home, shrunk from 57% to 23%. So our housing stock is rapidly changing in terms of its accessibility and affordability. And housing is a group project. I mean, you have federal government, state government, city, county, private, public, and the county's interest is really in figuring out, in our niche as social and human services providers, how can we affect change and build units for some of the most vulnerable populations? And we are proud to be part of Accelerator for America and working with the National Housing Crisis Task Force to think through, with the public land in Johnson County, what could be reimagined? What could be reimagined as housing or as other revenue opportunities to generate funding for housing? Because we know the cost of land is a huge barrier for development, particularly in areas like Johnson County, which prices just continue to rise.
I think that's great, and I really like that line. I'm going to steal it of housing as a group project, and part of that's the thesis behind the task force, right? Which is that you can't just change the rules, you can't just involve local government, you can't just involve developers, you can't just involve workforce. Is that housing is so complicated and takes so many actors to move on that you really do need intentionality and leadership and bring a whole host of people to the table in order really to be able to make it work in an effective way. So question for you all, something that I alluded to a little bit and something I've heard when I lived here and is, people say, hey, Kansas City is relatively affordable, which is true. Nationally, our home prices, though they've been increasing a lot, are still relatively low by national standards. So there's not really a challenge around housing. It's not something we should focus on with everything else that we could be doing in our roles. So I guess maybe starting with you, Terrell, what would you say to that?
Say that compared to the rest of the market, yes, it is a lot more reasonable compared to the rest of the market. But the reality is that we as a city don't see the own value in our backyard when everybody else does. And that is the key component of understanding where the problem needs to be resolved. Really understanding the education behind the fact that now a person that, as you alluded to in your presentation, that make average of $50,000 a year can't own the property they live in. So if you can't control that aspect of it, that identifies that we have a real issue. But I think we also have an opportunity for a real solution just because we do have, we can see the projections from the West Coast or East Coast. So we have an opportunity to get ahead of that curve by really being strategic and investing what we can do now. We have a land bank that doesn't function. There's plenty of assets there that can be rehabilitated. Every year, houses roll into the land bank. What happens to them? They sit there and go unclaimed, undisposed, and for some odd reason, you got one person working the whole land bank. That's something that could easily be invested, put back on the tax roll so we can increase the tax basis and sustain communities. To your earlier point, you can engage people within the community to work on these properties, to fix on them. That's an economic tool. We do it all the time. Put the barriers low for people to be engaged in their own community, create capital, and create opportunities. It's right here for us to take in. One of the requirements for the city, if you work for the city, is what? You have to live within the city limits. How many people in the city limits are on the brinks of houselessness that work for the city? Can the city simply create a property management arm, invest some of the housing trust fund dollars, and do a rent-to-own program that won't affect your pocket where you can easily transition to home ownership? It's low-hanging fruit that we walk past every day, and we simply just won't do it.
When I think about why should we care about these issues in a city that has relatively easier path, especially in the bottom 1/5 of wage earners and household incomes. During COVID, I was told that by well-meaning people that you know that look at federal policy is Kansas City is the 4th best metro in the United States as an urban area for housing attainability. Well, when you get under the skin of that and you get down to the numbers, it means that we have 1 in 20 households that are just extremely housing insecure instead of 1 out of 10 people. And when you get to those levels, and I'm just drawing numbers that are pretty representative of the facts, but my point is, I have developed out of that reflection point after that conversation or two we had during the COVID years, a review of those numbers in the Kansas City metro that made me say, well, there is a really good reason why people show up in yellow t-shirts and are mad. It's because they can't find housing that they can afford. And so you don't tell people just because we're doing better and there's fewer of you by percent that we have no problem to solve for. You know, there's a lot of people, and during COVID, the housing census of unhoused, unsheltered people went up by 50% in our city. And that's a disturbing thing that happened. And we just keep pushing demand. And now here's the other side of the people that showed up in yellow t-shirts. They helped Kansas City develop a policy that stopped all development at all price points and pushed the pressure of the market that could have afforded those units down. And so we went up higher at the lower 1/5. Again, the lowest 20% of households. We went up faster in rent growth than almost any metropolitan area. And in last year, 5 months, Kansas City led rent growth in the nation. In the nation, folks, that should be disturbing. That we had the highest rent growth in the nation. If you own a lot of real estate and it's residential, that's great. But if you're trying to solve for people that need housing, it's not great.
I think very similar in trends in Johnson County. Frankly, it's different, but the number of unhoused, unsheltered individuals continues to grow. And I think to your question, AJ, affordable and accessible for whom is, and folks in Johnson County, there's very few places where a teacher, a first responder, a construction worker can afford to own a home. And I think our community is better when we have diverse housing choices for all. You know, Johnson County has seen historic economic development. In the past 5 years, the state's 3 biggest economic development investments have happened in Johnson County. But homes are where jobs go to sleep at night. And so you can't have factories that don't have workers. And I think it's the opportunity to frame this as economic development is something that I've seen, at least the county's chambers and EDCs are really entering this conversation and having conversations at the state level with our policymakers when they try to do things like take away the Kansas Affordable Housing Tax Credit and take away tools that enable that supply side, right? And I think that is what it takes, quite frankly, is the dollars and cents approach to really move the needle, at least in our political environment right now.
Is it rude to everybody if I write down exactly that phrase she said? Where homes are where jobs go to sleep at night. I'm going to use that.
Please.
I think too, a stat when I used to work for the city, a stat I would always cite sort of to this point is that if you look at the percentage of households in Kansas City that are cost burdened by housing, which is a federal statistic that HUD collects and the census collects, which means you spend more than 30% of your income on housing. It is essentially as high in Kansas City as it is in San Francisco. And that's because it's a function of San Francisco generally has higher incomes, like home prices and rents are obviously much higher there. But as a measure of are you spending too much on housing, it really is not any different here than it is in some of the coastal cities we point to as that's where it's really bad. And I think that gets to, I think summarizes a lot of what you all are saying, which is that sure, we're relatively affordable, but also there's a lot of other factors that go into it, and if you're near the bottom or even in the lower half of the income and distribution, you might not be able to find a place that's affordable, even if we are relatively affordable as a metro. I see the mics being set up, so I want to ask maybe one more question before we open up to the audience, and want to make sure we have some engagement from you all. We talked about some of the barriers to housing production regionally. What do you see as maybe 1 or 2 major opportunities for the region? And that can be, you're talking about in your individual roles or just working collectively as a region to overcome some of the barriers you mentioned. And Joe, maybe I'll start with you since I know you have some ideas.
In Lee Summit or in Kansas City or in Johnson County, I think we ought to really look at who we're protecting with what rules. And because I'm not sure that we have the ability to change what I think is the biggest problem, which is the federal regulations on the reimbursements through HUD. I mean, it's like it costs so much to produce a unit that's reimbursable that nobody could build it without a whole bunch of what I call funny money. So, let's start with who are we protecting? Those are well-meaning rules at the local and federal level, but I would just challenge us without getting too specific. There's a lot of barriers that are artificial, and I'm going to steal one from TJ, and that is, I don't care if you're a school district or you're a city and you're sitting on real estate, I'm tired of watching them decay and pretending like we're going to put students back in them, or pretending like that all of a sudden that's going to be used for the purpose it was built for again. What I've found in my career of 40 years, degree in real estate finance, degree in architecture and urban design, and those 2 things, when I look at those projects, we would almost never build those buildings again the way they were built. So why don't we reuse them for housing now and not watch them decay and pretend like we're going to use them for their original purpose again? And let's get over that, and because we would be much better economically off as school districts and municipalities and county governments if we just built new buildings with current programming standards for those functions when we need them again. And that's what I would say we should do. And if you want to start in my neighborhood at the Bryant School, don't go through another 1-year process like they told us they were going to do last week. Just sell it and let somebody do something with it, because we could house people in it today.
Well, Joe, you're forgetting one thing.
Pardon?
You're forgetting one thing.
Yes.
Sell it at a reasonable price.
And sell it as a yes. Yes. Because it's not getting more valuable as it rots.
It's
in
negative
place.
value.
And that's pretty harsh, but that school has been empty since 2016. I think that's the right number, or 9. One of those 2 numbers.
I love that, Joe, and that is the work that, and I'll be very frank, I wish I had a shiny project to announce that the county is rolling out as part of the public land analysis, but coming to you live from the very messy middle of this work. And I think that is what it takes, is that willingness to kind of creatively reimagine public space and public building. Something that we're exploring is, can we do some mixed use with public building, you know? And how can you take property that's currently not at all taxable, add some taxable uses, potentially some so then it really maximizes the benefit for taxpayers and getting a community good and also bottom line. And I think we have to keep marrying those two ideas, that what can be good for the community can also be good for the bottom line, and those are not mutually exclusive.
I would say regionally, if we could have a regional building code.
Yeah.
So we can build like Lee Summit, so we can build like Johnson County, so we can actually get some products up that actually can get up and running. The building code in Kansas City is impossible to navigate. That's the number one thing. The other thing I would say, incentivize local investment developers, period. We give so much priority to everyone that doesn't live here, that's not driving past the asset. We roll out the red carpet for them every single time. Roll out the carpet for the people in your backyard because they actually care. Give especially a incentive to them. If we do that regionally, I think you will see a different cadence, a different care, a different way sidewalks are actually connecting.
I think those are all fantastic ideas, and I'm looking around, but I think we would like to invite questions from you all, if you all have them, to come on up and step up to the mic, and we'll have this great panel, have some discussions.
Hello. My question kind of tails off what you guys were just talking about. Something I've been trying to think about is how to activate vacant buildings and spaces. And I know there's various mechanisms to incentivize and in some cases punish people for leaving places vacant when they control them. Are there certain mechanisms or policy that you guys see that are effective that maybe we could implement locally?
I'm happy to answer at a high level, and we'd love your all's thoughts on it too. I mean, there's a lot of places have started to look at vacancy taxes and taxes on land as well to sort of understand, if something is lying vacant, right, it's not actually being a productive use for the community. It's also some ways a cost to the community, especially with things like land bank properties and things like that, where the public entity that owns it has to mow it, has to maintain it. And so that's one strategy. But another one is some of what I talked about with sort of the underutilized land, is just looking at where are those vacant properties? Are there ways to assemble them together and try to get them back to sort of productive uses as fast as possible, I think, to some of the points that Joe and TJ were bringing up a little bit, but would love to hear y'all's
Really
thoughts.
quick, I'll just say my favorite housing project of all the years, 15 years at Port KC that we helped do, was the Basie Court. And a developer from out of town unfortunately called and said, we want to buy this, and by the way, we can do what the current owner does and just rent out the 80% of the units that are habitable, and they could make money. Or if you guys will help us get tax abatement and we'll freeze the taxes and make sure everybody that lives there now that wants to still live there later can come back at the same rent, we'll make all of them habitable. And I think we brought about 40 units back to the market at 20th and Vine because we were able to do that. It costs so much money to do the project we did. And why couldn't we figure out a way in a city to do that all the time? And I always told people, just bring me 10 more of those, and we'd really push the needle. And, we probably entitled and bonded over 7,000 units of housing while I was there, but that 110 is my favorite.
I would say a lot of people might not know, but in the state of Missouri, it's an act called the Abandoned Housing Act. And it's very efficient to hold out-of-state or people that just don't care about their properties accountable in a way. I would say expand that act to different asset classes. That way you can hold the big commercial guy accountable, and also combo that with actual resources to actually engage the community to get those projects done. Because with those Abandoned Housing Act cases, you don't get title until after the project is done. So you have to need a substantial amount of capital up front. So I think that's a solution where if you're not going to do anything with it, we're going to take it. We're going to take it back, bring it back home, and get it done.
Thank you. Part of your presentation initially was about the expansion of the city limits lines, the growth out. Talk a little bit about de-annexation as a potential to some of this questions and issues.
So I will defer maybe to, I know Dennis had that as part of his initial presentation. I mean, that's a political question, right? For leaders of the city, is that something that folks want, right? I mean, I think the data that Dennis presented is true in the sense of what does it look like when you have a city that's expanded and how much does it cost to maintain various things. There's, one approach to that maybe could be de-annexation. Another approach could be growing the population to fill in more and have more residents, creating more tax revenue from both jobs and homes and investment. And I think that's a lot of what I'm sort of talking about and what we're advised nationally is to think about how do you get a virtuous, like we need more housing, right? Housing affordability is an issue. No matter what, we need more housing. So how do you do that as sort of a boosting economic development through creating more housing opportunity? I don't know if any of you all have thoughts on annexation as a potential solution, but it's more of a, I would say, political question, right? That is like, is this something worth doing? Is this something the city is interested in rather than, it's not just a question about land value, right?
I think when you look at cities in distress, that when the bills start coming due and you don't have new development that sort of pays for the stuff that needs reinvestment, you have to make those decisions. And what we've seen is in several cities in Kansas City, and let's talk about some successes. Mission figured out a way. They came out with 3 gateway plans. I was one of the people that wrote one of them that actually got built during a recession. So they brought density back in a landlocked city. So you can do this. Gladstone was on the brink of having lost their second, or almost lost their second Walmart, and they didn't know what they were going to do. And we also went up and worked on that one. And they built density at their city center, and they made it through. And they're viable, financially resilient cities today. So I think there are ways in landlocked cities that aren't greenfield development to figure these things out. But you have to start telling truth to people. And in the case of Lee Summit, before I got there, they just said to their folks, if we keep doing what we're going to do, here's 5 fiscal models. This is what we're doing now. It's number 1. Number 5 is the most dense. They picked number 4, half or 3/4 the way through that density, because that was the first one that had black ink. All right, so when you get 50 years from now and you have to start rebuilding everything, where does the money come from? If you haven't read Chuck Marone's book, you should read that because it lays out the case that we're all heading toward that fiscal cliff. And we're pretending like there's always going to be, that it's bad governance or it's something else that's the problem. No, it's not. These places were built to lose money over time. And if you just have to, at one day, figure out how you're going to pay the bill. And that's what we're talking about. How are we going to pay the bill when everything has to be redeveloped?
Hey, Joe, we got about 5 minutes left. Let's do these 2 questions, and then we'll finish up with one from somebody watching at home.
Perfect.
Good evening. On the topic of development incentives, so in 2019, Kansas City passed an ordinance, Joe referred to it earlier, that required affordable set-asides on certain development incentives that had been very successful to that point in creating a lot of infill housing. Has there been more research done lately on things like affordable set-asides and inclusionary zoning? And is there some sense that maybe those have been more hurtful than helpful? And at least in the sense of maybe infill areas or smaller developments, because I do think the unfortunate aspect is that you either have like single-family homes or 300-unit projects that can absorb that, and you've kind of wiped out the middle guys like TJ and myself and others.
It's a great question. I'm happy to talk about some of the national data here and then would invite you to talk about some of the local context. But, I know this is when the task force talks about right-sizing incentives. This is a lot of what we're getting into, and there's some really interesting stuff being done in Chattanooga as an example of a city that they're actually targeting incentives at the unit level, so at the apartment level essentially, or even at the townhouse level in some developments, where they're basically going to developers and saying, look, if you, we'll match you, we'll participate in this program, open your books up a little bit, we will match you with whatever the cost is needed to get a household at whatever income they're at, whether it's 20% AMI, someone making no money, or 80% AMI, to get them into that building, right? And it's sort of like a collaborative thing, and they're just piloting this, so it's a new program. But the idea is like, let's really just cut through maybe some of the back and forth and just say, how much would it take to make this unit affordable? How much did it cost to build? What are your operational costs? And if the city wants to prioritize affordability as a priority, right, let's make it work. So I think it's hard to answer that question overall because it depends a lot on the market, right? If you have a much higher cost market, then inclusionary zoning has less of an impact. But there's always a balance, right, of making housing affordable, more affordable, and also building more, right? And that's something that sort of, there's no, like, you have to find that sweet spot. There's not like a right answer of this is the right level of incentive for one place or even an overall metro. And so you sort of have to experiment that a little bit. How do you match it to the individual project need?
AJ, I'm going to plug that tool you talked about, because the county's looking at this a little bit, like this right sizing up incentives, because I think what it will take is a willingness of government to maybe reimagine a little bit what a return on investment is of an incentive, and there's the aspect of financial, but there's also the aspect of public good that's created by units developed. So again, no easy answer, but I appreciate the work that your group is doing to just try to put some structure and process criteria almost to have these conversations, because it is more complex than just what's black and what's red.
I want to circle back to what you were saying, Terrell, about the land bank. There are, for example, about 1,700 urban infill lots in Kansas City, Missouri. However, about half of those are contaminated by lead, some as high as 20 or 30 times the EPA limit. And nobody has really addressed how we would go about efficiently making these lots environmentally acceptable. I was wondering if you knew of any cities that are doing it right, because in Kansas City brownfields estimate that each lot costs 4 years and $40,000 to remediate.
So I think that gets to the heart of the matter. And the cities, this is a challenge in a lot of older cities all over the country, right? Is that if you had lead paint and houses were torn down, then those stats are in line, as I've heard, even higher in some places. So the question is, how do you set up investments and funds that are able to pay for that cost, and does that pay then off ultimately in the cost of rebuilding a house? And I think this is actually in some ways a challenge of Kansas City being relatively affordable is, in some of the economics of it, right? If you can spend $40,000 on a lot and then to then build a house is going to cost $200,000, $300,000. What is that house going to rent for? Who can afford to live in that house? And is that reasonable for a lot of the folks, especially the folks we've been talking about who are really struggling on housing production? So the short answer is there's no right one there, besides just it takes a lot of investment. The federal government has had some programs in the past, the Brownfields program being an example, that have done it. But it's also hard to aggregate across a large number of small lots, right? It's easier. A lot of those programs are designed to do bigger sites that were maybe industrial rather than smaller ones. So maybe there's a new federal program out there to help with this.
I could be wrong, but I think we have a unique situation with the amount of structures we have vacant. I don't understand why we can't focus on that first. Because we in the middle of a crisis, what is the quickest way to get somebody under a roof? Using existing structures and get them rehabbed and done. Joe mentioned schools. It's 27, 30 plus schools. Those make great 2-bedroom, 1-baths. It make a great incubator for SWOPE or University Health to go at the base of it. The number one issue we have in our communities is daycare. Where could those go? At the base of a school. It's those simple things that we keep walking past. If you could drive down Prospect, look how many big homes sit there vacant. Going back to the zoning, it's 7, 8 bedrooms. Couldn't those be per room rented out where somebody can't afford the utilities, but they can afford a monthly cost? So we can talk about vacant land all day long, but what about the existing structures that we can get up just like that?
I have a great respect for, when I mean respect, I really think it's our responsibility to produce healthy places for people to live. Having said that, the house I live in is full of lead, and it's 2 blocks from here, and I paid quite a bit of money for it, and I would tell you that I know I'm exposing myself to friable lead every single day I live in the house, and yet I live there knowing what that risk is. And I know that it's encapsulated, and I know what we're talking about here is lead that is friable, and a child could go out and get a scoopful of dirt and ingest some. And that's no different than my grandmother's house with peeling paint when I was a kid in the 1960s. And we were exposed to it too. And I think at what point, again, I'll just go back to the first statement, one of the first statements I made. Who are we protecting that we're going to wait until we spend several, potentially $100 million to clean up all the lead that we have contaminated our ground with? Or will we figure out how to cap and build? For instance, on the riverfront, we have a lot of hazardous issues that were in the ground due to coal gasification plants. The answer was cap it and build over it. But you know what the weird thing was? We can rent apartments on the riverfront in Kansas City, but we can't sell single-family for-sale houses down there because all of a sudden we care about that is a different standard, and the people that live in that get a higher standard. My point is, it's important to protect children from lead, but at what cost are we protecting them instead of housing them?
All right. I want to finish up with one question from somebody watching at home, and then you all will stick around if people have additional questions for a few minutes. Yes? Okay, good. All right, somebody watching at home wants to know, does the state and local housing action plan work to provide tools to create walkable communities? And if not, is that something the National Housing Crisis Task Force might look to implement?
That's a great question. And so, what's interesting about housing, and this is a tension in the task force, right, is that it's bipartisan, it's intentionally focused on housing. Now, I sort of mentioned transportation in my presentation as being something that's clearly linked to housing, and Accelerator is an organization where I work for. We actually do a lot to help cities invest in transit, to figure out how to build transit better. So we believe in all of that. I'd say a lot of the things that I'm talking about, naturally as a side effect of them, would create more walkable communities. When you're talking about finding ways to reactivate public land, vacant land, to finance infill development, that sort of naturally on its own does create more vibrant, welcoming communities. And the Accelerator outside of the task force does a lot of work on transportation. But I'll say these two things are linked inextricably, right? And HUD has actually done some research in the past on looking at, right, what matters is really for a lot of people is not the cost of housing or the cost of transportation individually, it's together, right? If you might be able to afford a little bit more in rent if you can take public transit to work, and maybe you get away with one car instead of two cars in a household. So I think it's absolutely critical to talk about all of those things. I think it's just a question of, sometimes when you try to do everything, you do nothing. And so that's at least the way the task force thinks about this, is let's focus on how we build more housing, but that I think a lot of the solutions that we have would naturally help with that.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for all of your effort to move our city forward.
Thanks for coming, everyone.